Hi friends, I hope everyone's doing well. Let's get started with the collage for day 16. As you can tell from the supplies, this collage won't be heavy on the use of paper. I want to lean into mixed media. The ground will be painted with shades of red, so I brought out black and yellow-orange light to mix with it to get the various shades. I prefer to mix in other colors besides white or off-white to get a lighter shade. Sometimes mixing in white or off-white can make the color look chalky. For example, with red, I prefer to use yellow, orange, or in this case, a light yellow-orange. Again, this is my preference. I'm painting a similar design to the one in day 15. This is the base or ground layer, so it won't be the focus as it was in the previous collage. Leading into the mixed media aspect, I'm using yellow and pink color pencils to make a few loose light line marks on the ground, then finishing off this layer of marks with a black Posca pen. Back on day 6, I use this technique when you apply a heavy layer of paint over the whole surface, then come back in with a brush handle or something similar and scratch away some of the paint. For this collage, I'm using this technique, but only applying paint in 3 areas. These 3 will be considered as elements like cut paper. These elements will be in different sizes and orientations. We've got horizontal and vertical. Next on to adding some color paper, not too much. There's a lot going on, so I'm being mindful of adding a few pieces that add to the design, not to distract from it. I typically don't use the shade of green with red because it makes me think of Christmas. I need to work through my preconceived ideas about certain color combinations because it can be limiting to my art practice. As I build this paper layer, I'm being mindful of the overall design, placing the paper so each one will be an enhancement, cutting the papers into different sizes and shapes, also to have them placed in different orientations, and to make sure to add some contrast, some light or bright colors. The finishing touch is to add a few more marks with the color pencils. Here's the finished mixed media collage. There's many layers to it that I find satisfying. I like the layout of the paper elements as well because it has movement. This was a day that I didn't have any idea of what I wanted to create. It was getting late in the evening and I was running out of time. I pulled the daisy ephemera to use as a focal point, then pulled other papers and ephemera that I thought would coordinate with it. I pulled more than I thought I would use so I would have options. I didn't want to keep the daisy ephemera as is, but I did want to use a large portion of it. I thought it'd be interesting to incorporate it with this blue monoprinted paper. I hadn't spliced two papers together in quite some time, so I wanted to do it with these two. I used small pieces of washi tape to secure the two papers together. Using the daisy ephemera as the guide, I cut a curvy line. After I cut the two pieces, I still needed to trim down the combined element. I wanted this element to be large, but I wanted enough room on the substrate for a few other paper elements. A suggestion to make sure you have a new blade in your X-Acto knife. I didn't do this step, and some of the daisy paper tore and wrinkled a bit when I cut it. I'm happy that the daisy paper was easy to glue. It was printed on thin, inexpensive magazine paper, so I was concerned that it may wrinkle. Now that the focal point element was in place, I worked on adding a few painted papers in the remaining areas. I was being mindful of choosing papers that would enhance the focal point without being a distraction. Here's the finished paper collage. It's very simple. The only element that was inspiring or interesting to me is the focal point. I like the contrast between the bright Daisy magazine image and the blue monoprinted paper. The shape of the two pieces where they meet was a good detail. Also, the size of each element is different. If both pieces were the same size, I don't think it'd be as interesting to look at. This is another day that I didn't have any idea on the design going into this session. I pulled a few pieces to see if my creativity would be sparked. Sometimes it's best just to start cutting up different color elements to see if it would jumpstart a design idea. I like to cut larger shapes because I can always cut the shape smaller if needed. It's better than cutting too small at first. I decided to glue these two elements down as is to see if the next step would emerge. Since the two elements are large, the next step would be to add a smaller element. Again, I wasn't sure where this design was going. By knowing that a good design will have elements in different sizes, it helped to move the process along. Also, the orange paper is a good contrast against the blue and green existing papers. I tried to remove the mark with an eraser, but it wouldn't budge. I'm pointing it out because I resolved that issue in a bit. I decided to bring out some markers at this point. Another way to add elements to a collage is to draw them with markers or color pencils or oil pastels. Instead of filling in the shape, I thought it'd be a nice detail to add those elements with a minimal design in each one, so some of the substrate is showing through. I want to point out that the light blue element covered up the smudge that I couldn't erase. Next up, I brought out pink and aqua paint. These colors will coordinate with the existing colors on the collage. If I had known the design ahead of time, I would have painted these shapes first. Now I have to paint around some of the paper elements, so the painted elements will look like they're behind or underneath them. I'm using a towel to place under my hand. I didn't want to rest my hand directly on the artwork and maybe smudge the elements that were created with the markers. The design looked a bit plain, so I brought out these oil pastels to add at least one element or accent detail. Since the colors are mostly mid-tone values, I thought that adding a black element or detail would add some much-needed contrast. I started by creating another element similar to the pink and light blue ones that were made by markers. I thought it'd be better than introducing a new design element. It looked a bit odd, like it was floating on a page, so I started to add to it by drawing another shape connected to it and filling it in. Then I thought, why not add two lines that connect with the two of the edges? The lines are grounding the element so it doesn't look like it's floating on the page. Here's the finished artwork. I'm hesitant to call it a collage because I only used 3 pieces of paper. Even though it doesn't have an exciting design, it's balanced and cohesive. Even though yesterday's artwork wasn't a masterpiece, or it didn't have an exciting design, I thought I could use it as an inspiration for this next one. My plan was to see if I could elevate the design by adding a few more elements. I'm starting by cutting a few elements from the papers to get a basic design, then create a painted layer before gluing the paper elements to the substrate. I did the opposite for yesterday's artwork. I'm lightly marking the placement of the paper elements before I remove them before painting. I want to have a basic idea where I can paint, so knowing the placement of the paper elements helps with this step. I almost forgot to mark the 1/8 inch guideline from the gutter. I'm marking a horizontal line where I want two paint colors to meet. This line helps me to visually see the size of each area before painting it. I like to paint slightly over the guidelines to give myself some leeway when I'm placing the paper elements. I may want to slightly change the placement before gluing the elements down. Now that the painted layer is dry, it's time to glue the paper elements in place. I want to point out that this color palette isn't one that I typically use. The bright jewel tone papers with the muted painted elements. It's good that I'm trying different color combinations during this 30-day project. I may find ones that I want to incorporate in my art practice. Next, I'm adding marks with different color pencils and paint markers. The aqua pencil was visible on the gray painted element, but it didn't show up on the light blue painted element. I tried a few different lighter color pencils, hoping the marks would be visible. Anyway, I decided that I wanted to come back in and go over those marks with paint markers, but first I added transparent gesso on top of those areas. I wanted to make sure that the paint markers would be able to adhere to this area. This is something I haven't tried before. It's another benefit of having a small sketchbook journal, trying techniques like this one. As you can see when I apply the green Posca marker, that it shows up on these areas better than the color pencils. I continue to use different color paint markers over a few other areas to add line details. Here's the finished artwork. Again, I'm not sure if I would call it a collage or a mixed media collage. I do think it has a better design than the previous day's artwork. I decided to give the design style from the last 2 days' artwork one more try to see if I can develop it further. Again, I'm using bright painted papers and muted paint colors. As I did previously, I'm cutting the paper elements to size and deciding on the placement before painting the ground layer. I'll add music as you watch me finish this section and come back after the paper elements are glued in place. Now it's time to add details with colored pencils and paint markers. I wanted to see what this design would look like if I drew lines around the elements and filled in some of the smaller sections. I like the look of sketchy pencil marks where the lines are uneven and some of the underneath color is showing. Here's the finished artwork. I like the basic design, but I don't like the look of the outline around all the elements. I'm glad I did it just so I can visually see what the outlined elements would look like. Out of all three of these similar designs, I like day 19 the best. Changing up the design for this next one, I decided to start by painting the ground or base layer first. My design plan is to have a washy first layer using gray and off-white paint, then adding a pattern using my handmade stencils on top. Lastly, I'll be adding painted papers with geometric shapes. I'll add music as you watch me create the ground layer and come back for the collaging section. Here's the paper selection. I played it safe by choosing colors that coordinate with the pink and light blue stencil pattern. I won't be using all these papers, but I wanted enough out so I had options. This pattern paper already had a square cutout, so I decided to use it as a guide for the first pattern element. I want the elements to be large for this substrate. I think that large elements on small substrates will create a bold design. I think the subtle pattern on this blue paper is enough to work for this design. I wanted another element that is cut so enough of the ground layer is visible. At this point, the artwork has a light value, which is the ground layer, mid-tone values, which are the two pattern paper elements. Next, a dark value is needed so the design will be balanced. Only one large dark value element is needed. This mid-sized triangle was cut already. I decided that the artwork needed this size element and it fit in perfectly. It ties in with the shape of the dark blue element and it's the same paper as the large element in the upper right. It helps to add balance and cohesiveness to the design. I could have left this artwork as is, but I thought that adding some line details with this pink Posca marker would tie all the elements together. It's another way to add cohesiveness to the artwork. I like this finished artwork, from the light washy ground layer to the bold paper elements to the pink line detail. Let's go on to the last collage of this week. I decided to end this week with creating a paper-only collage. When going through the ephemera, I was drawn to the dark blue papers with the black patterns and the dot pattern that's orange, and I think black. I'm not too sure of the initial color. I monoprinted that paper a long time ago. Then I pulled the other light to mid-tone paper so the collage will be balanced. Also, I want the elements to have geometric shapes. Another thing I decided to do was glue as I go, so I didn't overthink the design. As you'll see, it was a bit tricky to cut elements to fit into certain blank areas. I started with the mid-tone value papers first, then came in with the light and dark value papers. At this stage, I could have left this collage as is. It had a balance of all three values. There were different sizes of elements, but again, I wanted to elevate the design and push myself to add a few more dark elements. Also, I hadn't used the orange dot pattern paper yet. By adding two narrow triangle shapes, I think the design is successful. I love this color combination. I made a note to use it again in the future. Well, that's it for this week's video. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to watch it. I hope to see you next week for the final set of collages. Take care.